Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. If you're new to our organization, we organize, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this biweekly conversation series. Wow, we're almost, is it 3 years ago now? So we found it so effective that people are able to more easily take part in our education work this way. So we've decided to continue it indefinitely. We're hoping that this conversation series can help us engage and sort out how to make the changes that we've all been yearning for. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generation. For Zoom etiquette, we're happy for anybody who'd like to keep your video on. Again, we are live streaming tonight. We'd love to feel connected that way. We do ask that you keep your audio muted if you're not the one talking. We'll have some time for Q&A later, and you'll be welcome to either use the hand raise function on Zoom, or you can put an asterisk in the chat and I'll recognize you, or you can just type your question in the chat and I will read it aloud for Dr. Howarth to respond to. So we are excited tonight to have Whitney Howarth, who I have known for, I dare say it's been almost 20 years since I was a student at Plymouth State. And Whitney has been a board member of New Hampshire Peace Action for 8 years or so, and has been involved. She recently left the state, although she's staying on the board and engaging remotely. Although we do see a little less of her now than we did when she lived in New Hampshire. But she's gone on to do some really important work in schools. She has, it involves restorative practices, and I'm gonna not say too much, just that we're really happy that you're here, Whitney, and thank you so much for bringing this new vocation that's always been something that you're interested in and passionate about, and have brought to our board as a practice and as a passion. And we're glad to learn about how it's being used around the country to build a better future.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate this opportunity. It's nice. It feels like old home week, coming back home. I'm going to share my screen and my PowerPoint here to get us started. Okay, and I have two screens, so pardon me as I kind of look back and forth. Can everyone see that? And I'll put it on the proper view. Slideshow beginning. Yeah, so a little bit about myself. I just recently left academia. So I was a professor for 17 years at Plymouth State University, and I was a professor of world history, and had been in academia in grad school in Boston before that, my master's and PhD in world history from Northeastern. And I always had a passion for telling stories and hearing people's stories. I always say I'm very nosy. That's why I like history. I want to read people's old letters and dig around the archives for their, dirty secrets. But I think what I really loved was the connection I felt when I could tell stories from the past that had either been silenced, or people who had been made invisible, or people who had either strategically been lost or by accident of sort of circumstances been left out of the sort of mainstream story. So I want to begin with that this has been a long time passion of building relationship and connection, not only with my students, but with people around the world. I consider myself an anti-racism education. I taught quite a bit about empire and colonialism and capitalism. And so the work that I'm doing now at the International Institute for Restorative Practices is in some ways a continuation of, I think, the best of that work. And when I say the best of that work, I have always had an interest in education and how we educate young people. As a peace activist, I was always pushing the limits of how much activism and social justice I could bring into my classroom at a state university in rural, predominantly white New Hampshire, and sometimes got myself in trouble, but was always dedicated to the cause of nonviolence and justice, equity and inclusion. And so about 5 years ago, through the Unitarian Universalist Church, and a member there named Sarah Elizabeth Anderson, I learned about restorative practices in another model, a model that was developed by Dominic Barter in Brazil, in the favelas of Brazil, working with communities that had experienced harm and conflict and violence to bring communities together to have circle discussions, not only about what they were witnessing and experiencing and feeling, but also problem solving and solution making. And so I did the training with Sarah Elizabeth, and I continued to do that work in various spaces, both within the church in Concord, New Hampshire, and then beyond. I got a State Department funded grant to do some restorative work with Sarah Elizabeth in Rwanda. Unfortunately, COVID hit, so we didn't actually go to Rwanda. Well, I was in Rwanda, but the actual training we did was online, which was fascinating to do extensive work with folks in another culture, on another continent, in another language. We had translators in a very different paradigm for problem solving and conflict resolution. And then last year, December 2021, I discovered the International Institute of Restorative Practices, which is based here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where I'm speaking to you now. And I want to recognize that this is the ancestral and present-day home of the Lenni Lenape. What's really interesting about the model that IIRP follows, it's really rooted in Indigenous practices, ancient practices, and practices especially that communities of Maori in New Zealand and Aboriginal people were using in Australia. And it really developed out of some of those conversations with communities who were losing their children to addiction, disease, the criminal justice system in those places, and really developed strongly in the 1970s and 80s here. I think what's interesting about the International Institute for Restorative Practices is that it is a graduate school. It has a full-time faculty who teach regular courses. You can get a master's degree in restorative practices. You can also get a master's certificate, which I'm working on currently. So it'll be my second master's, and I'm really excited about being a student again. It grew out of a consortium of two nonprofits, the Community Service Foundation, you see there, CSF, and Bucksmont. These two nonprofits, again, established in the 1970s by a gentleman named Ted Wachtel. You may know his name. He wrote Tough Love in the 70s. He developed a system of institutions that supported youth who were challenged in traditional schools. So he created all sorts of programs, alternative schools, foster homes, especially for adjudicated youth who were referenced to his services in his school and foster homes through the court. And this, he also provided counseling, drug and alcohol addiction counseling, family group conferencing, which is very much part of the Maori tradition of New Zealand. And his vision was rooted in restorative justice, which you may have heard of, which is primarily a model that recognizes that harm, when done, criminal behavior, misbehavior, hurts the victim and the offender and the community. And so it seeks to repair and restore relationships with an understanding that it's not just a victim and offender, but it's a larger context of community that's often harmed. And so the witnessing and the accountability and the repair has to be done in a broader context. So when Ted founded the consortium, he started also realizing that restorative practices was something that went beyond restorative justice. And I would say the major difference between those two concepts is that when we do restorative practices, we're often doing them preemptively or proactively. That is, we're building relationship and community in whatever setting we're working in, whether that's schools or prisons or churches or hospitals, nonprofits. We're doing that relationship building 80% of the time. The responsive is 20% of the time. And so they both go hand in hand, and you really need to build a space of trust and honesty and sharing of feelings and needs. You have to build a space where people feel vulnerable, they can take risks, a place where people feel connected, where they belong, before you move on to, or before you can be really successful, I would say, with the resolving of conflict or the repairing of after harm. So Ted did that work, and little by little, and in the 80s and 90s, it developed into a full graduate school with a full faculty, international faculty from all over the world who are doing restorative practice and research. And our faculty come from various fields. We have PhDs in education, EDDs, we have counselors, we have criminal justice and criminologists. We have people who have worked again with in parole systems and criminal justice, youth justice systems, wide variety of backgrounds. And so today, in addition to having a full accredited university where we grant graduate degrees, we also do outreach into the community. We call it continuing education. And that primarily takes the form of professional development trainings. It could be a 4-hour event, a 2-day event, a 4-day event, depending on the various models and programs we have. And we can do that publicly, where we just open it up and see who shows up, like tonight. This might be considered sort of an introduction. Or we can also book privately with, if a company says we want to bring restorative practices into our board for New Hampshire Peace Action, we would contract with you, and we do special trainings and establish support systems for private organizations that wanted to do it exclusively with their own community. My title officially with the Institute is Restorative Practice Instructor and Implementation Coach. And coaching is when we go out into, especially the schools, but again, we can go into various contexts and work with various constituencies. I work with public schools, K through 12, across the country. We also have a branch in Canada, and we have partners all over the world, Latin America, Singapore, various countries in Europe. We're working on expanding our work into parts of Africa and Asia, but we worked in South Africa, the Caribbean. So the coaching that we do, I fly all over the country. I'm new, I just started in September, and we go into support principals and leadership, both at the sort of district level, in the specific buildings, and then underneath the principal, the various, we call them restorative leadership teams, to not only deliver content, but also to help those people implement what they see they need in terms of restorative practice. And this is of course after everyone in the building, from the teachers to the custodial staff to the cafeteria workers to the office workers, everyone gets trained in the basics, which I'll share some of that with you tonight. And then the idea is to bring that into the classrooms, into the cafeteria, into the hallways, at pickup and drop off, right? This is a paradigm shift, restorative practices. We often tell teachers who feel overwhelmed with programs and initiatives, we're not one more program to add to the plate. We are the plate. So whether you're doing, SEL or PBIS or all these different wonderful programs that are out there, this isn't another one. This is a framework or a lens through which to think about how you communicate, how you build community, how you develop relationships. And then we do have an arm or division of our organization that's consulting, and we are expanding again into all sorts of community private partnerships, state governments. I think once we were talking to the Pentagon, I don't think that that panned out, but different spaces from the corporate world, to the nonprofit world, beyond schools, where people might think this is useful to how they organize. So what is it, right? What is this thing I keep referring to? The IRP definition is here. The idea that it is in of itself a social science. It's a way of understanding how to strengthen relationships and build social connections to develop stronger communities. I want to just take a look at my time here. There's a great video. I'm not going to show it because I want to be able to have lots of time for us to have questions at the end. If I could ask Will or Doreen just to copy paste that YouTube link into the chat for people if they want to like grab that later. Maybe that would be useful. I don't know if you can do that from.
Unfortunately, I can't because it's just.
Oh, you can't touch my screen. Okay.
Yeah. Although
All
if it's in your presentation, I can dig it out there and I can do that while you're
just
talking.
Before the end of the night, just because it's really cute. It's 2 minutes and it really explains in much more detail how beautiful and empowering and inspiring I think the idea of restorative practices are. But we can delve into that as we go along. Whoop. Dance. I think to sum it up in a nugget, the aim of restorative practice to develop community and to manage conflict and tensions by repairing harm and restoring relationships. And some people will say, well, what if we didn't have a relationship to begin with? If you're in community, if you are, a group of people who share a space and share, a central experience or identity, maybe a value system, whether that's a school or a church or a group, a nonprofit group, there's some sort of relationship. Relationships, might not be deep, or they might have complex dynamics, power dynamics, dynamics of who gets to speak when and with whom, but there's relationships, right? So the idea here is, how do we strengthen those connections so that people who are part of a community feel that they belong? And so we talk a lot in restorative practices about belonging, feeling like you have a voice and you're valued, feeling like you have agency to impact the culture of your community, feeling like there is a role for your vision for what the community can be. And so this is how we do it. Here's some more specifics about what it looks like. We always start our trainings with Ted's, what he called the fundamental hypothesis. And all the material that we have in our trainings wasn't developed by Ted. He comes from a criminal justice background, but he and several of his colleagues who were academics spent many years researching, reading everything from affect psychology to counseling to criminology, sociology. So everything that we present is researched and documented and footnoted. And we continue to expand that because we're a university. We constantly are publishing papers and articles and books. We have our own press and sponsoring. We just had a few weeks ago our annual global conference, which just every year knocks my socks off because the panelists are doing phenomenal work, from prisons to schools, again, across the world. So I can, if you go to the iirp.edu webpage, which I'll have in the last slide here, you can start to explore a lot of those resources, which are free and open to the public. I thought we might take just a minute to do a little restorative practice because, practitioners got to practice. And I know that we have a pretty good sized group here. How many did we have? I think it was in the 20s when I last peeked.
35 right now.
Oh, okay. So unfortunately, so we in IRP, we do check-ins every Monday morning, and we do have a lot of circles. But just to give you a feel for what a circle might be like, we do a sort of a check-in. We do some norm establishing, and then we do a check-in at the beginning of our meetings, and then we do a circle check-out. So we won't all be able to participate today in this, since I only have a few minutes to present, but I thought it was worth hearing some other voices. So what we'll do is I'll share the prompt after I talk a little bit about the fundamental hypothesis. And then I'll just ask maybe 3 or 4 people to share out. The idea would be that we would go either sequentially or non-sequentially around the entire circle. We have a talking piece, and every single person in the room would have an opportunity to speak and be heard, and then also to pass if they didn't want to participate. So I'll give you the prompt there. It's on the bottom of the circle activity, and then we'll just share out a little bit just to hear some voices besides mine. So here's the fundamental hypothesis that we put forward. Human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So we talk a lot in our biz about building relationships so that we're always walking towards the with, right? I want to have a relationship with you. And that means, again, giving you voice, giving you choice, we'll go through some of those specifics of how we do that. Being vulnerable, being humble, being transparent, being honest. There's a lot of ways we, in a classroom or in any space, can create a dynamic that's more about with. I think historically, we could probably say that our school experiences have been very punitive, very much about compliance, obedience, staying in those rows, staying in those chairs, doing what's assigned. That's the to. We'll do education to you. You better comply. Even if you have a very kind-hearted, beautiful professor, right? I, for many years, was very punitive and very to. And then the permissive, the for, I'll do everything for you. I don't want you to have to stress or strain. Let me take care of this for you, which kind of sounds nice, but assumes that the other person doesn't have agency or ability because they need people to do things for them. It doesn't really hold them responsible or accountable for their actions either, because it was done for them. So let's do a little quick check-in. Think about a person in your life who helped you make a positive behavioral change. And then think about how did they help? And I'll just ask people to keep their answers to, like, you know, a simple, if you want to name the name, you can. Simple, like this figure in my life, this teacher, whatever, coach. And then just like maybe a sentence of what was it about them that helped you? What about the relationship? Okay, let me pause the share for a minute. I can see faces. And if you want to put it in the chat, you can do that too. Give you a second to ponder that. Positive behavioral change. Anyone want to start us off? Yeah, Will.
Unmute. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was in high school, there was a teacher I had who kind of looked like me, or vice versa. And he was he was a coach of the football team, the basketball team. And he was bright, he was funny. And he affirmed who I was. I think that's a key word.
Nice.
For me. And I guess I tried to emulate him. He was a role model for me. His name was Don DeVona.
Wonderful.
And as I said, he was from Chicago, and he was a Cubs fan, born right next to Wrigley Field. So I remember him always. Got to meet him almost 40 years later. We had lunch with his wife, my wife, in Chicago.
Nice.
And it was great.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. I see Mary wrote in her the chat, my son, he's very logical, and I know he loves me. He's an adult. So his love and his logic helped you make a change, a positive behavioral change. Anyone else want to share? You can raise your hand electronically, or I can look to see, Will help me look to see if any fleshy hands are raised. Oh, Cheryl?
As I'm in the midst of applying for residency right now. Wish me luck. Grammarly has again been a
I'm sorry, Will, we're gonna have to ask you to mute again.
my personal statement.
Thanks, Will. And I see, oops,
Sorry.
that's okay. Cheryl, go ahead.
I remember as a kid, I was my mom was divorced and my dad left, so I was a lonely child. But I remember my neighbors always used to invite me over for coffee, which was mostly cream and sugar with just a little enough to make it seem real. And they would talk to me about books and encourage me to read. And so they really took the time to model and to influence me. But they, like your quote said, they did it. They just didn't say, go read. They read books, gave me books, sat with me over coffee, and really modeled that for me.
Beautiful. And they shared their love of something with you in hopes it would ignite your love of reading. Did it work? Nice. Other relationships with an individual that had a positive, one more, behavioral change. Anyone else out there?
Got a couple in the chat. Got one from Lois. 2 Zoom classes on racial justice opened up an awareness in myself.
Okay.
And another from Michael. Religion, church, family, making me feel welcomed and belonged.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, the pattern is for our understanding of what positive behavioral change requires is, you've already mentioned this idea of modeling, but not in a do as I say, not as I do, or, kind of angry, like I'm going to set these expectations and you better meet them, but more of a with, right? Like, so high expectations. Here's some clarity of what it means to be a good athlete, or what I think it means, to love books. This is kind of an expectation. I'm setting the standard, but high support. I value you, I affirm you, I see you, and I can support you in this endeavor. So high expectations, high support. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me go back to sharing if I can here.
I have something I want to say.
Go ahead.
I was in a group. I was going through therapy, and so someone told me to go to this place, and they meet up every once a month, and they have speakers. I went to a speaker meeting, and I heard this man's story, and it was just so great. How he was raised, and then how he had to turn himself around, and then all these wonderful things. I thought, wow, could I be just like him? Could that happen for me? I mean, it was that moving for me. I loved it so much.
Wow. So that idea of the model, the person who inspires. And sometimes we can get that from a TV show or a book or a class, but I think that the idea of a relationship with someone who sees you and hears you and values you and affirms you in such a way that's makes you believe in you, right? I mean, it sounds schmaltzy, but really like that relationship. And I've had really positive relationships with very kind of authoritarian figures in my life. And I've been scared into sort of obedience because I was raised in a home with violence and trauma and abuse, and being a people pleaser and being like obedient was the way you didn't get hit. But I saw that throughout my life, those authoritarian teachers or coaches or bosses were not the ones that inspired behavioral change. They inspired compliance for fear of consequence, but they weren't supportive necessarily. You can be a really strict teacher and be super supportive, but you've got to be willing to put time into that relationship. You can't just be, the dictator. So let's go to the next page here. Why am I not able to see my next slide? Oh, there we go. So here's what I was talking about. We use this thing that Ted called the social discipline window. And on this axis, you can see control. Sometimes we'll say expectations or limit setting or discipline, low to high. And on this axis, you see support, low to high. And what we have is sort of in the traditional systems, maybe in school, very punitive, or maybe neglectful, or maybe permissive, right? 2, not 4. High control, but not a lot of support. High support. Oh, what a warm, fuzzy teacher that was. So compassionate and kind. but boy, did she have no classroom management. Kids were just bouncing off the walls and the chalk was flying and we never knew what was due or when, but it was fun. But the ideal is in this quadrant, right? High support, high control, or high expectations. So what do I need to do? What are the tools I need to get there? What are you going to do to help me practice, experience, and achieve? What supports are you going to give me? And so this is why we talk about walking towards the with in our restorative practice model. We're not always going to be there. Some days I'm as punitive as heck to my 8-year-old kid, to my husband. I'm a restorative practitioner. I'm not a saint. And some days I'm just like, you know what? You guys are going to screw this up. Let me just do it for you. I have no faith. We don't have time. We got to go. Let's go. Right. And sometimes I'm just exhausted and I neglect, right, the relationship or the thing. But this is where we're always trying to walk towards the with, the restorative relationship. There's a lot of psychology in research and counseling that takes a look at what are the barriers to us being in a competent, healthy, happy, cooperative, productive relationship. And I am endlessly fascinated and reading every book I can about the psychology of affect and the psychology of shame. There's a lot of stuff on this, but I think you can imagine that when we are faced with information or judgment from others that interrupts what we call a positive affect, having positive feelings, positive emotions, that we are sometimes shocked because we're going along our day and everything's going well, and then a jerk cuts us off in the road, or a boss sends a one-line lousy email, and we are instantly feeling shame, the affect of shame. And that disrupts our positive affect, our joy, our sense of safety. And it can be a big response or a small response, and we might not even register it. But there are different reactions we might have, right? And some people also talk about fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn. But this work comes out of Nathanson, who wrote about the ways in which sometimes this can be very destructive to positive relationships. So we have to be aware and self-reflective of our own shame responses. And then we also have to be aware of how, if we're functioning in a punitive space or a neglectful space, that sometimes we can trigger these reactions of shame. Sometimes they're healthy and sometimes useful and sometimes not. And I've been in therapy for years and years, looking at my own history of trauma and my own childhood. And I recognize now more than ever that sometimes it's the silliest thing that make me respond when I feel exhausted or hungry or tired and someone points something out. I can go into self-attack or attacking others. So we take a look at that. We also take a look at affective language, so I statements that are able to speak transparently about feelings. And this is something in our culture we're not really good at. Maybe our culture is better than others, not better, but more practiced. I feel angry when you interrupt me. I feel frustrated when I come home and find the dishes that aren't done after I've asked you twice. Please do them. There's all sorts of ways to identify feelings without blame or shame, right? Without attack. I am feeling this when this happens. And then with students, really clear expectations of what I need you to do next. Because again, it's not about being permissive and, just lovey-dovey hugging. It's also saying, these are the expectations. How can I support you? What do you need to achieve this? This we call the restorative continuum. These are the various practices that we would spend, 2 days in training talking about, from these sort of affective statements to also asking affective questions. And we hand out this little card to all our participants. It has two sides. These are affective questions are a little different than restorative questions, but questions basically that get people to talk about their feelings. And especially after harm is done, here are some of the questions. This is for people to help those harmed by others? What did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you and others? What has been the hardest thing for you? What do you think needs to happen to make things right or to move forward? The questions on the other side are to respond to challenging behaviors. So students who may be harming others or the community or disruptive. What happened? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you have done? To what, and in what way? What do you think you need to do to make things right? And you can hear the roots of that so restorative justice piece, right? That there's been harm done. And, you know, sometimes these are questions that, you know, a principal or a teacher can ask of a student, or a colleague to a colleague, or a principal to a staff member in the school context. There's really no rules about which way this goes, because the ultimate goal is to understand what harm has been done, to hold people responsible, to figure out who's accountable for the fixing, right, or the repair as much as can be done. And it might be multiple things. And it's not always an apology. Sometimes it's an action or a different path. And then that restoring the community. Maybe more people in the class were affected by what you did, why you chose to be disruptive. Let's take a look at the larger harm potentially. And again, not to shame, not to blame, but to get people to reflect on their choices and to be held responsible. I want to do more research because I'm an academic at heart into the indigenous roots of these practices. There are a lot of books and papers that have started to scratch the surface here, but we know that, you know, from we have examples from the Navajo people to particular communities and nations in South Africa, that there are systems of connection and community that are still practiced today, that also have ancestral or historical roots that go back to ancient times, that we could learn a lot from. You might have heard of the East African concept in Swahili of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are. And these are, you know, it's like we're rediscovering some ancient wisdom and trying to apply it to 21st century problems of disconnectedness and violence and power dissonance that we are really, really struggling with today. And I think COVID put a magnifying glass for all of us to some degree, to wake up to stories we hadn't heard before, to injustices and oppressions we hadn't considered, to roots of violence and power struggle that maybe some of us weren't aware of. But I think also as educators living through COVID and living through remote learning and living through the trauma of that, both our students' trauma and our own trauma, because it was hard. It's really hard to teach online and to be separated from our pupils, our community. I think one thing we gained understanding of is when the kids came back, it wasn't just about learning loss. It wasn't just about math and reading. It wasn't just about academics. We really had to attend to the whole child. And as a whole school, we needed to start talking to each other. Counselors had to talk to teachers, had to talk to wraparound services. You know, we have really diverse populations. In some of the states I work in, we have a lot of refugee and newcomer populations, immigrant populations, socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. The trauma is extreme, and it was only exacerbated by COVID. And so, you know, you hear about SEL, social emotional learning, you hear about PBIS and other positive incentive programs. Restorative practice doesn't try to replace that. It adds a framework or a lens. How do we do that more effectively? How do we attend to the whole child? We've got to talk about food insecurity. We've got to talk about homelessness. We've got to talk about, you know, chemical dependencies and violence in the home. And I think, well, we can get to this later, but I think that's why there's also a backlash in some parts of this country to SEL or to some of these conversations, because it does open up the home and connect the home to the school and connect families to their children's educators and vice versa, and in a way that might be uncomfortable for some families, but it might also be super empowering for some families who just feel so disconnected that they're doing it all on their own. So there's a lot of interesting conversations around that. Okay, time check, Will, what are we looking at here?
We are at 7:40.
Okay, so
So
I
we got
should,
about 20 minutes. Definitely want to
okay.
get to
Let me
Q&A as quick as we
Yeah.
can.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah, so I want to leave you with 2 slides. To walk towards the with, we have to engage others. We have to be willing to have systems in place that actually ask each other, what do you think? What do you feel? What's happening for you? How is this landing for you? And again, sometimes in traditional educational models, we just deliver content and then we assess standardized tests, right? But what does it look like to be with each other in learning spaces? That means giving people voice to share, reflect upon, and acknowledge their own feelings. And this is huge. I don't think we realize how disconnected we are sometimes to our emotions. Building relationships is a constant practice, right? And I tell my teachers all the time in the schools, right? It's not like you just do that on Fridays, giving kids a pizza party. It's a constant practice of impromptu conversations, affective language, saying, checking on kids in the hallway. Oh, you look great today. Oh, I like your sneakers. What's going on at home? What are you reading? That's a great question. What are you reading at home? What's your favorite band? Who do you hate? Who stinks? What do you think of the Super Bowl halftime show? Like asking students to have a voice. That's a big part of our relationship building. And then choice. We didn't talk a lot about that, but this is important in systems change and organizational change. It's not that the leaders don't have authority to make policy, but how are they doing that in an inclusive and participatory way? How are they hearing the voices of people who will be impacted by their choices, by their own policies? So having these kind of spaces where people get to say, this is what I think this feels like, or this is what would be effective, or this is what I need. And then the principal or the boss or the supervisor gets to ultimately have the power, the accountability, but they have heard and have considered other voices. I won't have time for a checkout, but I'd love you if you would put in the chat, and I'll ask Will or Doreen to save the chat for me. I'd love just to hear what landed on you, with you. How did this land for you? What resonated? What interested you? What would you like to know more about? What surprised you? Time always flies when I talk about this work because I love it so much. I love it. I'm inspired by it. It's hard work. There's nothing easy about restorative practice, not in my personal life, not in my professional life, not in the schools I work in. It's constant vigilance and self-reflection and a willingness to take risks and be open and create brave spaces, because there are no safe spaces, right? Brave risk-taking, to ever be more purposeful and intentional in my relationship building and helping others do that in the schools. I think that would make a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney. So we've already got some questions and prompts in the chat. I'm going to actually back it up. Linda Dunn, when you were sharing the chart that had control and I think it was compassion,
Support.
support,
Yep,
so control and support. Said, can you explain what high control means? So can you talk a little more about what that axis is measuring or inferring?
Yeah. So limit setting is a good way to look at that. Clear, explicit expectations. This is what I need you to do. This is the timeline. This is how you're going to get there. This is how you'll check in with me if you get lost on the way, right? So really clear spaces that clear guidelines for achievement or behavior. If I walk into a room or a school that is highly punitive, high control, but low support, it might look to the outsider as heaven. The kids are walking down the hall very properly. Everyone has their shirts tucked in. If there's a uniform dress code kind of thing, everyone's sitting at their desks very neat, but there's no relationship necessarily there. A lot of kids are compliant and obedient, maybe because their parents expected of them or their teachers, this is what the consequences will be if you don't meet my expectations, right? So 2 is, it might look traditionally like, hey, this place has got it together, but in actuality, they're not supporting necessarily or having relationship. And that's when we move over to the with. because I always said I was a very hard-ass professor. I had a lot of expectations on my syllabus. And I would also be so accessible and bend over backwards if you came to my office and said, I'm lost, or I'm overwhelmed, or I don't get it. Like, I would spend hours with those students. So high support, high expectations is sort of the goal, to get to be in that with space in the relationship. Does that help?
Does that help, Linda? Does that do the trick?
A little bit. I don't like the word controlling. I don't know. I think
not controlling, control. And again, you can put expectations in there, you can put discipline. You can there's consequences for behavior. There are clear expectations for what you need to do, but it doesn't have to be an authoritarian regime. Control in itself or discipline isn't bad, but what does it look like? Are you also giving me voice and choice and a sense of purpose and value? And do we have a relationship here? Because that was sort of the point of that question. What was your relationship like with that person who helped you make a behavioral change? It was pretty clear what the expectations were, maybe, for your change, but you needed that person to, believe in you and give you support to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Whitney. I'm going to jump to Lois's. So Lois Maganos would have liked some real examples of the process. Can you? I know that your job is to train educators in how to facilitate the process, but do you have examples of where this has worked in schools to work? Do you have a story you can share?
Yeah, sure. So many. So as a coach, I go into a school for an 8-hour day once a month, and I'll visit them every month for 13 visits in this one school I'm working in. We have a contract with the entire city district, 50,000 students and 9,000 teachers. So we've trained the 9,000 teachers in the restorative model that you got a tiny taste of today. And we do that training, and then we will follow up with these implementation coaching visits. I primarily am there in the service of the principal, who is seen as the top tier, the leader of her or his team. They will identify other constituencies within the building that I will coach and work with: assistant principals, instructional coaches, behavioral interventionists, counselors, social workers, psychologists, the restorative leadership team. So I will coach them, and we will look at some of our behaviors and our choices. How are we being punitive might be one lesson, versus how are we being with, right? How are we being restorative? And we look at specific ways, for instance, during passing times. How do you motivate students to move along and still be supportive and have relationships with the students? And so we start to see in some schools, rather than "you're going to be late, let's move it, don't talk, close your locker, let's go," we start to see an expectation, but the language might change, I need you to move faster. Hey, how's it going today? Right. So it's not just a constant punitive kind of instruction, but it's also, here's an expectation. Hey, I see that you're really trying to get to class on time. Thank you. Right. So affirmations, positive reinforcement, connection, and relationship. We see behavioral changes when students feel like they have relationships, and we have stories of that. Students who are coming from homes where there's a lot of perhaps neglect or control without support, we see students want to show up and want to feel connected and want to be a part of something. And so not only do we see behavioral changes, and there's lots of research on our webpage about that, we also see academic performance. We see literally test scores going up. When we can also use circles, not just for discussion and exploring feelings, we can also use circles for content. Anything that gives students choice and voice. And it's not a one-way delivery, right? So it infuses pedagogy, it infuses behavioral and conduct codes. Suspension rates go down, bullying goes down, violence goes down. And we can look at some really tangible evidence of that when students feel a belonging and a connectedness. It's really powerful stuff.
I was going to jump to Matthew yet. Did your question get answered, Matt?
I wanted to just say something. I really like that word restorative. And so I guess it's a little bit off the subject, but this week, I watched the State of the Union address. And then actually compared it to the Super Bowl yesterday. And for quite a few years, I found the Super Bowl to be very restorative, like for our country. Even if a person is not a sports fan, there are plenty of interesting things like commercials with celebrities we know. And the halftime show, you know, Rihanna was pregnant and she was up flying above the stadium. And so when you compare that to the kind of like the fighting at the State of the Union, I just found the Super Bowl to be a very restorative event. Right? Just wanted to share that.
Despite the t-shirt tug, right? It's interesting, right? It's so interesting. I mean, I personally, since, you know, I'm almost 50 and I've seen a devolution of community and a sense of unity in our country. And it spikes and it wavers depending on events. But I think a lot of us would just probably echo this idea that we are more disconnected and more, you know, lacking in harmony as a nation than perhaps we've ever been. I mean, we could debate about the Civil War, but this idea that there's this constant kind of, you know, this shame responses. If you look at the comment sections on the internet, people attacking, people withdrawing. I'm not going to look at Facebook. It's evil. You know, there's just this, and who knows why, right? But there's this constant sense, I feel, people being besieged with anger and vitriol, and you can find the happy kitty videos, but it's almost as though we've forgotten what it means to be part of community. And I see that in neighborhoods. I see that in PTA meetings and school board meetings. I see that, you know, there's just these very small oases that I find in my world, church choir, book clubs, where we come together to connect at a deeper level. And I just want more of that. So I hear what you're saying, Matt. I think it's a great observation. And
you know how people always talk about their favorite commercial?
Yeah.
My favorite commercial was by Kia Telluride. It was the Binky Dad. And so I don't know if they were getting on a plane and they forgot the child's binky. So the father was like, I got this. And he had to drive the Kia through the gauntlet. I mean, all kinds of hazards. And he had people in the way, but he also had people cheering him on. And so he came through. He delivered the binky. It might have been the wrong color, but
right. And what do you think was about that commercial that gave people, and probably a lot of people felt a connection to that? Do you have a sense of what it was that made people really connect to that story or that narrative?
Well, I immediately texted a friend who has 2 foster children, and he's like, that's me all the time.
Right. It's that shared experience of being a parent in desperate crisis, right? The lost bear or the lost binky, right? It's that human, that universal. And I feel like, yeah, we're so set in our ideological ways. And trust me, I get as righteously indignant as the next liberal, but we get so set in our ideologies. I think we're forgetting that we can connect, that we can find universal value in these things that bring us joy and human dignity. We can still be activists and fight for truth and, you know, justice, but then do we have conversation compassionately, honestly, self-reflectively, with a little bit of humility? It's something I struggle with because I'm always right and I always have an opinion. My husband's in the kitchen listening to this. But, you know, a little bit of humility goes a long way in restorative practices. What can I learn? What can I see differently? What can I be surprised by? What can I learn more about here? Yeah.
You know what I loved about that commercial is the support that father racing all over the world for the binky, the support he got, how people were watching and behind him.
Go. The expectation axis was like, gotta get the binky. The kid needs a binky. The support axis with all the humans who went, oh, we've been there, honey. We're here for you, right? They were in the with quadrant. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions?
Yeah, well, we've got about 5 minutes left. There are 2 great questions in the chat. I'm going to start with Helen's, and there's also a bit of a correction here. So, Helen's from Tanzania, and she wants to flag that that's not a Swahili word.
Oh, sorry, Helen. Thank you.
So that was I was up there. I did a quick Google search and found that it's in Kirundi or Kinyarwanda.
Oh, sorry. That's right.
Ubuntu is
Kirundi.
a word. It's Utu. It looks like it's Utu in Swahili. Helen, is that right? It's Utu, the Swahili version of that word, or a similar concept? Sure if Helen may put something in the chat if she doesn't want to.
All right. Thank you, Helen. I
Unmute.
appreciate the correction. Thank you. Ubuntu is Kirundi.
But there's also a question attached to that. So
Yeah.
I'm curious how restorative practices engaging marginalized students. I think the South African communities and indigenous communities referenced earlier were able to nurture a deeper sense of community because their culture, customs, and beliefs were reflected in their community spaces. So more inclusive because all involved were represented and reflected in the community spaces, if
Oh
that
my
makes
goodness.
sense. When students
Absolutely.
of color are in the minority, how do restorative practices engage their individual needs and invite their sense of belonging?
That was
Got
Helen's
about
question.
3 minutes left, and there's
All
one
right.
more good
Oh, man.
question. So I don't
Well,
know if you
first of
can do it
all-
really quickly.
Sure. Beautiful question. Can't at all begin to cover it all. I think the answer is culturally sensitive, aware pedagogy. I think the work that restorative practices needs to do to engage the families and the community around the schools is essential. And we're still kind of figuring out how to do that, because especially working class immigrant families especially have really crazy busy work schedules and multiple jobs and multiple commitments, even perhaps more than others. I think that when we talk about inclusivity and cultural awareness, the space is the same, right? What is required to nurture a true, authentic sense of belonging? And if teachers are not open to getting a better understanding of that, they need to talk to their students. They need to talk to their parents and guardians and families. They need to understand, they need to open that space so that they are not the authorities. They are humble and open to the receiving and the learning. I totally agree with what you say about the shared values that people have in certain cultures, and then they come here and they're dispossessed or dislocated or disenfranchised or marginalized. And so it is a constant struggle. And we know, especially with families of color and people of color, they have been harmed by the system. They have not been well served by many systems, but especially education. Right? We can talk about the school to prison pipeline. We can talk about the war on drugs. There's so many examples of how specific systems and injustices and oppressions have targeted families of color as well as individuals. And so we have a lot of repair work to do to bear witness to that, and then to be humble enough to say, what do you need? What do we need to do to make this better going forward for you, for your community, for your children? And partner with these families, not tell them what they need to be doing better. Thank you, Helen.
All right. And so, Whitney, I'm not sure if you've got a few minutes after we turn off the live stream, but there's one more question from Sue Blaine that I think I'd love to hear the response to.
Okay.
But unfortunately, I need to do my outro. My 7:59 cutoff has been reached. So thank you all for joining us tonight. You can stay in touch with NHPA by checking us out at nhpeaceaction.org. You can check us out on Facebook. This will be available on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel. So you can check that out tomorrow. We'll send out the link tomorrow as well. I know some people had to leave early. This series will remain free and open to the public. However, if you are able to contribute anytime, check us out, nhpeaceaction.org/donate. Our next couple conversations, 2 weeks from today, we're going to have Colin Powell's former chief of staff, Larry Wilkerson. He was also a colonel and worked in various posts high up in the U.S. government. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about what's at stake with the Ukraine and what the U.S. should do next to try to work towards peace there. So I know Colonel Wilkerson is someone I've gotten to have lunch with a couple times, and he is a really cool person to hear, and he knows a lot about this subject. I'm looking forward to his talk. So join us 2 weeks from today for that. March 6th, we're going to have part of the Spirituality of Peacemaking series. We're going to host Joel Berman, Becky Field, and David Grishaw Jones, who went to Alabama to do some compassionate listening to folks from both sides of the 50s, 60s, and 70s civil rights movement. March 13th, Judith LeBlanc is going to talk to us about the connections between Indigenous issues and peace building. So hope to see you all 2 weeks from today and 2 weeks after that, and going on after that. Thanks again to Whitney. Good night. You don't have to leave. We're going to keep Whitney for a couple more minutes to answer some of these questions, but I am going to turn off the live stream.